mentioned caused pandemonium, got to the podium and said, I know who you will nominate, the last survivor. It wasn't him, but you're the last survivors. But I think this will be a very interesting panel. And I want to introduce it because what we're talking about, media wars and culture wars, I think are central to the topic today. Jim Rutenberg, and we'll go from my right to the end of the table, is the media columnist and a former political correspondent for the New York Times, who has written breakthrough pieces on issues ranging from Trump-style alternative truth to the Me Too movement. I've known him for years and years. He's a good friend. Nick Goldberg, another friend, in fact, everybody on this panel is a friend, is the editorial page editor of the Los Angeles Times, who previously wrote or reported for the New York Times, Vanity Fair, the Sunday Times of London, and was an editor at New York Newsday. I first knew him before he went straight when he was a pollster, and a damn good one.
Don't tell. Don't tell my secrets. I didn't know that.
Brian Callier is a close friend of the Institute and is now publisher and CEO of the LA Weekly. Before that, he was opinion editor of the Southern California newspaper group. And before the 2016 election, he bet me publicly at one of our forums, and correctly, that Donald Trump would win, although he added that he did not favor that result. Ange-Marie Hancock Alfaro is a professor in the USC Political Science Department, the chair of gender studies, and a globally recognized scholar on the intersection and impact of race, gender, class, and sexuality on public policy and public dialogue. Her current work includes research on the free speech, hate speech debate that prevails in this country. I'm going to start with a general question. You can each take a crack at it, starting with Jim. For years, we assumed that the media were reporting reality as best they could determine it, and that news and opinion were separate. Was that an accurate assumption? And if so, when and how did that ethic change?
Well, I'd like to believe it's an accurate assumption. From my own experience, when I started as a reporter, we just wrote the news. I started in the New York City tabloids, and a fire was a fire. Even a political fight was a political fight. Everything wasn't put through this grand ideological debate, right? So I used to write about the transit system, and I would kick the shit out of them every week. And it wasn't some anti-big government move, right? But today, I realize that would be seen in this, I'm sure I would be on Fox News a lot every time I wrote about the broken down subway system. So it did change. I don't know. I think the polling on this is so all over the place and sometimes contradictory. I was looking at something today on the plane here. It was an Edelman study. They call it the Trust Index, and it showed that trust in media in the United States had dropped like 8 percentage points over the last year, but trust in journalists went up. So I think that we still haven't kind of gotten our hands around what's really going on, but I do know that I was at my in-laws' Easter party with a bunch of crazy Hungarians on Sunday, and I was getting the fake news, fake news, fake news shouting, which has never happened to me at a family gathering. So something's definitely shifting here.
Ange-Marie?
Yeah, I would agree. Thanks for having me, Bob. I would agree that things are shifting. I think the thing that's been really most interesting to me is the selectivity with which people are using and talking about the media. And so I think that's part of, a technological shift that's happened, right? Like we have our phones, we have everything that we can kind of access, and we can choose much more than 50 or 60 years ago when there were 3 networks and you went to one of those 3 networks and you were either a Cronkite guy or, you were this guy or you were that guy, right? You weren't, necessarily really thinking about, I'd like to choose what I watch beyond like what was already kind of offered to you pre-selected. I think the other big shift that's happened with that technological shift, so you have the technology. I always liken the technological shifts kind of to things like tectonic plates because you can't really necessarily control what's going to happen once the technological shift kind of takes place. But I think the other thing that's kind of come up that I think is particularly problematic, I guess I can just use that word, is the notion that anybody is a journalist, right? So part of what starts to happen is anybody reporting because of user-generated content develops this legitimacy, and I think one of the things that at least my colleagues in journalism have really been concerned about is where and what role do journalistic standards kind of play? Not among the journalists, on this panel, but among the folks who are kind of, YouTube sensations or, bloggers and other folks who haven't necessarily come up and been socialized in an arena where there are expectations about fact-checking. There are expectations about wanting to display both sides or really understanding, particularly for politics, right, that there are democratic implications, as Jim was just talking about, to things that are said when they are now going to be read through an ideological lens. And so thinking, that next step forward before you push publish on the blog post or before you, put it up on YouTube, I think has been something that has really shifted because of some of these technological advances. So I don't want to sound like a Luddite, but I do think that some implications have come from these shifts.
Nick?
Well, I don't want to repeat what everyone else has said, so I'll start by saying I agree with what both of you have said, and I'll make just a short pitch for the importance of the old distinctions and the old traditions that were made in the by mainstream news organizations. I'm just a huge believer. I'm now the editor of the opinion pages of the LA Times, but I came up as a reporter, and as Jim was saying, we were taught that the goal of being a reporter was to put your biases aside, to keep your opinions out of what you wrote, and to try to not write a he said, she said, not fail to challenge people when they said something, but to try to keep your own values and opinions out of what you wrote so that you presented unbiased facts for readers to make their own judgments about, decide whether they agreed or disagreed or which side they wanted to fall on. That's a hard thing to do. We didn't always succeed at it. We made mistakes. Our biases sometimes crept into what we wrote too often. I think that's too bad, but I stand by the importance of what we did. And what I often say to people is, I like to read opinionated websites. I like to read opinionated magazines. I read, The Nation. I'll read the New Republic. That's all fine. But if you were going to take away every piece of information, every piece of journalism except one from me, I would say leave me my New York Times, because I need, at the end of the day, to have the best possible layout of the facts so that I can make my own judgments. That's the most important thing to me. It's unfashionable these days on the left and the right to support the old-fashioned sort of mainstream news reporting at its best. But I think it served a huge purpose, and I think that the melding of news and opinion, the distrust in mainstream reporting, the ease with which people claim that, the ease with which people disbelieve facts which ought to be pretty settled, which is pretty clear where they come from and what the sources are, et cetera. I think that's a real danger, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that
Brian.
as the afternoon progresses.
Sure, no, and I agree with everything that's been said. I think that, it's hard to point out when this changed and when this assumption in the veracity of news changed or the bias of news reporters changed. I think that most certainly with the advent of technology, this was the start of it, right? Because you had a group of people who for a very, very long time, which is kind of Republicans and conservatives, who said that the news market does not serve us. This is biased. It's leftist. And you've heard this years and years and years. And then finally what happened with the advent of technology? They said, okay, we're going to create our own blogs. We're going to create our own information sources. We're going to create Fox News, which became the most profitable news network and probably still is in a very long time. And so I think with the advent of that, you had folks on the left who matched that. And now I think what you're seeing is a constant fight back and forth, which is unfortunately seeped into mainstream news outlets. Not all of them, but most certainly some of them. And in my opinion, watching the 2016 election and leading up to it, I frankly think because Donald Trump was succeeding and being so successful that many journalists in this country, many awesome, respectable journalists, freaked out because they could not believe that this man was going to be the nominee for the Republican Party, and most certainly that this man wasn't going to be the president of the United States. And in that moment, even with me running just the opinion section for 11 newspapers, I saw in our newsrooms where people were literally saying, like, freaking out and like having, you know, just really, really angry reactions to this, which was completely natural because it was nothing that any of us had ever seen before. And so I think that once Donald Trump became the president, that had an instantaneous effect that exacerbated any of the discussion points and conversation that we're going to have today, because people then took it upon themselves to fight what they believed was extremism, to stand up against what sounds to some like fascism. And I think that you saw an opportunity within the media landscape that people were like, we have to fight this, we have to fight this. Similarly, the defenders of Donald Trump on the alt-right, if you want to call it, or even conservative media outlets, did the exact same thing. And it pushed us into a landscape where anything that seems almost remotely conspiratorial on either side is all of a sudden true. And unfortunately, it's helped discredit, I think, really good journalists who are doing important work. And you see that in the Edelman Trust Index, which I saw as well. You saw that in a recent Pew study, which said that 53% of Americans no longer trust the media. And if you believe in the importance of the Fourth Estate, if you believe that we need a functioning media for the success of democracy, this should be the most important and scariest issue of our time.
So Ange-Marie mentioned Walter Cronkite, and you've all talked about traditional media. In the 1960s, we largely had a common knowledge base, driven by the dominance of newspapers like the New York Times and networks like CBS. Imagine what would have happened if a young producer had come to Walter Cronkite and said there was a group called the John Birch Society holding a press conference in New York that day to reveal that both President Eisenhower and President Kennedy were collaborators in the communist conspiracy, and then asked, how many camera crews should we send? Cronkite would have looked up, taken off his glasses, and said, long before Donald Trump did, you're fired. Today, it seems that any group, any conspiracy theory, any attack, no matter how uncivil, can not only get a hearing but be widely heard. People speak of America as two divided nations, coastal and heartland. I think that's oversimplified. But in terms of news and information, aren't we two nations or even three or four operating with very different and contradictory knowledge bases? And how much does that distort our politics, or does it primarily reinforce existing divisions? And anyone can start.
You want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think there's no question that people are getting their news from a million different places. We no longer have a shared understanding of the news. These places contradict each other. Liberals trust one set of news sources. Conservatives trust others. And I think that Pew study said that 47% of conservatives say that Fox is their main source of news. People on Facebook, on social media, people are inclined only to see and read things that confirm what they already believed. It's a scary situation, and the result, I believe, it's a key driver of the polarization that we're seeing in politics generally. I mean, Republicans are moving to the right, Democrats are moving to the left. Democrats say they have more negative views of Republicans than they used to. Republicans have more negative views of Democrats. I think the whole thing is terribly damaging for our ability to move forward as a country, because we don't, if you don't have a shared understanding of what is the truth, then you can't carry on conversations, you can't agree on what the solutions are, you can't agree on policies, and it's just a prescription for more polarization, for more dysfunction, for more stalemate in Congress. And
So it doesn't create the divisions, you think? It just reinforces them?
I think it moves in both directions. I think more polarized public, moves left, right moves right. They only read things that they agree with, but it moves in the other direction as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it both creates them and increases them. Frankly, I mean, let's just look at the election in 2016. A foreign government thought and understood that our country was so divided and that the information sources in our country, media, was so contradictory that they could spend money to impact the outcome of the election. So very smart people in an intelligence apparatus for another country recognized this trend and exploited it in an election, which tells me that this is a really big problem, because we're going to continue seeing this happen. Because if you're on the left, you watch MSNBC, you read certain publications. If you're on the right, you watch Fox News, and you don't have any kind of recollection of the life experiences or the arguments of the other side. And that's really unfortunate and scary, because then you can't even have a conversation about what the actual facts are, or what moving forward actually looks like. And when I was giving speeches, and I think I even did this for you, Bob, at the Unruh Institute, I would ask people during the election cycle, during both the Mitt Romney and Barack Obama election and both the Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton election, if I was speaking to a liberal audience or if I was speaking to a conservative audience, I'd always say, where do you get your information from? And then in the liberal audiences, it was MSNBC, and the conservative audiences, it was Fox News. And I would say, how many of you think that Donald Trump will win the election? Conservative audiences said yes, liberal audiences said Hillary Clinton. But when you started to go down the list of every different issue, it was like two different worlds. And I think the way in which media is approached today is continuing to exacerbate it. And the scary part is, I'm not exactly sure how we fix it without some form of movement of narrative-free news. And at this point, and probably critical thinking taught at a younger age in school, both K through 12, and then also in the university system. When I do a lot of talks, I teach a class at Chapman, but I also do a lot of talks to students. And one of the things that they always ask me, well, what do we do? Like, how do we understand our information? And I'm like, everything that you hear, independently verify yourself, because you can do that. Don't take anything you read on the internet, or especially social media, as fact, because oftentimes it's not.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add, perhaps because I'm the political scientist on the panel, is the role of government here. And I think another thing that we haven't yet talked about is the shift in FCC policy and the way in which that's really created some complicated trends with regard to deregulation and consolidation, right? So if you're looking for local coverage of news, the amount, you were just saying, for the previous question, that you used to oversee, coverage for 12 different papers, right? And so the way that creates economies of scale, which are good for capitalism, right? Not always so good for democracy.
True.
So I think one of the things that we really want to think about is the way in which the FCC, as a policy body, has also played a role in Americans' ability to actually understand and get a variety of news. So I don't think that takes away from the idea that we have this polarized, these two polarized sets of news sources. But I think what ends up happening is that there's also an echo chamber, even in the center, that makes it very difficult for folks to really start to parse out and to say, okay, we really just want the facts about what's going on, and the facts that are going on about something that's not, for example, Stormy Daniels, right? So a host of other things are going on at the same time that Stormy Daniels appears on 60 Minutes, and everybody is covering that as a news story, and then there might be local stories that don't get covered and other things that end up going away that are actually much more important. So one of the projects Jim and I just found out we worked on together 2 years ago was something called We the Voters. And I consulted on a couple of those videos, and one of the videos that I consulted on was talking about the role of state and local politics, and how about 80% of Americans' lives is actually more affected by what goes on at the state and local level. But of course, we know because of these changes in FCC policy and then the economic kind of imperatives of running different kinds of news organizations, it becomes difficult to actually cover all of those issues.
Well, it's interesting. We'll be affected by state and local politics more than by national politics until we have a war in Korea. And then we'll be affected profoundly by national politics. Jim, you may have a comment on that, but I want to ask you a specific question. We've seen the revival of the Washington Post. We now have a vigorous, prospering New York Times. I guess one impact of that has been the president's attacks on Jeff Bezos and Amazon because he owns the Washington Post. But does it have a wider impact? Does it make a difference? Or do you feel you're just speaking to an already politically self-selected audience?
You know, that actually works with what I was going to say of the last question anyways. I think, first of all, I don't know if they're two distinct worlds of media, right? There are little different ones. I still think a majority of the country starts with from a fact-based place, and maybe if they're a Brett Baer viewer on Fox as opposed to a Sean Hannity viewer, they might think they're still working in real facts, and they see things as different priorities or different levels of interest in terms of a scandal or what have you. In terms of the Times, I think in this environment and the Post and this new interest for some of us, a lot of it clearly is people who want us to be the resistance, which we are not, so they're going to be sorely disappointed, and at times they get very angry at us. But I also I really do believe that some people who just want the real facts and understand that that's what a lot of our newsroom does, no matter where we are geographically and what the skew of our newsroom is, that fundamentally there's a fact hunt. And so I do think that's been to our benefit, and people are subscribing for that reason. And that's a really great positive development, because we may break a story in the Russia investigation that the president will call fake news, but then when the special counsel brings a subpoena based on that reporting, or there's real legal consequence to what we found out and it's corroborated, you just can't deny that. So but the part of the world that is becoming untethered from facts, that goes to sort of the social media phenomenon that we were talking about, where it's a sea of opinion. And in the old days, and even till quite recently, even an opinion writer at the LA Times, at the New York Times, at the Washington Post, at the Wall Street Journal, they had to be working in the same set of facts. They had to. And Twitter and Facebook allows the debate to come off of facts that are way off. And so you have these sort of unreal debates over things that are fake, and that's kind of the big sort of hole in the center, or the sinkhole in the center. But fundamentally, I do believe that some of the gains are coming from people who just want real reporting.
And what percentage of the country do you think that is? I mean, how self-selected out into silos are we at this point?
I mean,
are we a majority?
Clearly, I don't think that a majority of the country, again, is going for the fake stuff. Clearly, the New York Times readers, probably not. We don't have a booming subscribership in the heart of Mississippi. But we do. But one move that the paper did even before all this was to get into local Starbucks. So you can drive through, on Route 66 in Texas, end up at a Starbucks, and there's a Times there. So I do think it's not as bad as we think. And to your point, you have this caveat in your question about where geographically how this breaks down, and there are parts of Long Island where it's Trump country and real fake news Trump country. So it's all more complicated than the debate lets it be.
I mean, hopefully we'll get a revived Los Angeles Times too.
Well, I was going to say it's exciting to me to see that the New York Times is selling as many digital subscriptions as it is, and that the Washington Post is back on its feet again. 4 or 5 years ago, the Washington Post was suffering just as much as the LA Times has been. The LA Times, as most of you in this room probably know, has gone through more than a decade of changing ownership, of cuts, of firings, of declining circulation, of declining ad revenues. And, I believe personally that it's extraordinary how good the paper is day after day, given the kinds of cuts we've gone through. But it has been really rough on us now. We're in the process of being bought by a new owner, a deep-pocketed billionaire, one of the wealthiest men in Los Angeles, and the jury is still out on what his intentions are, how much money he wants to invest in it. Does he want to, as Jeff Bezos did, come in and hire 100, 120 new reporters? Does he want to beef up our farm bureaus again? Is he focused on covering L.A. and the county of L.A. and the state of California, which for all I've already given a big compliment to the New York Times and saying I wouldn't want to give it up, but the New York Times doesn't cover California the way the Los Angeles Times does. So yeah, I'm hoping for a rejuvenated paper, and I'm cautiously optimistic that what's happened at the Washington Post could begin to happen at the LA Times.
So somebody mentioned, or a number of you mentioned, and we heard it earlier, the Marjorie Stoneham Douglas students. They became heroes to many. And then they were slimed as crisis actors. It was even charged that one of them, David Hogue, wasn't at the school during the shooting. He was actually crouching in a closet and as a student journalist trying to take notes and protect people while it was going on. None of the sliming was true, but the darker side of the story reached millions and was believed. I think these kids moved the needle on gun safety. But does this kind of warfare make it profoundly difficult to resolve an issue? I mean, that we immediately sort ourselves out and go to the trenches?
I think 100%. I mean, I think that there's no doubt. I mean, I was watching some of the, the memes that came up online on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, discrediting or attempting to discredit students who literally had just seen their friends die next to them in a school shooting. And people were able to online come up with enough people who were ridiculing them, attacking them, demagoguing them in so many different ways. And it's unfortunate because that's how politics and I think media as a byproduct has become impacted in our country today. It's almost like every issue, no matter how black and white, no matter how dire, no matter how consequential, pressure groups are easily pulling the strings of far too much media in the country, and that's becoming this echo chamber of anger or hate or false narratives or fake news, God forbid you use that term. And it's become a real problem, which makes it almost impossible to solve any real big challenge like gun safety in our country. I most certainly agree with you. I think that these kids particularly move the needle forward. I don't think that you can win no matter how big your group is, like trying to demonize kids who just went through a mass shooting. I think that that's just silly and stupid. But I think that in every one of these situations, you see the same kind of thing. You see this instant outcry, this anger, this demonization and character assassination, frankly, of anyone who is advocating for a particular viewpoint. And then, unfortunately, the reality is the issue fizzles out after a while because people are either disgusted by the way it's being covered, are angry, are resentful, are confused, are frustrated because nothing happens no matter who seems to be in power in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere. And I think that our industry is unfortunately in that kind of trap at the moment.
One great example, I think, and it's pre this era, is healthcare, right? There was the whole death panel lie. And the death panel lie was based around something that Newt Gingrich supported, which was end-of-life consultation that, can save medical costs but save families pain. And, these are discussions that are believed by many experts on both sides of the aisle, at least previously, to be worthwhile for the system. And that became the idea of the death panel. They want to kill you. They want to kill you. And Sarah Palin was a big proponent of that. And how can you have a legitimate bipartisan debate when that argument's being made by the likes of Sean Hannity and Sarah Palin and 46% of the right end of the spectrum, that's the only thing they trust. So we saw it then, and now it's only, 1,000 times worse.
The times when death panels were being alleged actually said it wasn't true. But the paper's gone much further now and has actually used the word lie, used the word frequently untruth, as kind of a corrective, have said, for example, that the attacks on the students who were in that shooting are untrue. Are you amazed to see in your paper the word lie in a news headline?
I mean, I don't personally, and as a media columnist, I've sort of, part of my job is to have an opinion about that, and I'm not terribly comfortable with the word lie, actually. Here we are.
Even if it is one?
Well, if it's a definite lie, when the president said what a beautifully sunny day we have here at my inauguration while it's pouring on his head, that's a lie. But the idea it goes to intent makes me a little uncomfortable. I think on the time we really used it on the Obama, when President Trump said, okay, it's not true that Obama was a Muslim or whatever he was saying, that I think I was comfortable with its use. But it really has to be done sparingly. I think false, untrue is good enough.
I completely agree with you. I'm glad to hear you say it. I think a bunch of newspapers have overstepped the line on the use of the word lie. You guys do. It's in the opinion pages, but still, you have that long list of 100 lies that Trump has told, and you go through it, and one after another. A few of them look like they might be lies. A lot of them are misstatements. You don't know if they're lies. A lie, I think. Everybody's common understanding of the word lie is that it involves intent. You have to know what's wrong. What's his name? Blumenthal, who is it in Connecticut, who said that he served in Vietnam and he didn't serve in Vietnam? That's a lie. He knows whether he served in Vietnam, and once it's proved untrue, you can call that a lie. That's not true about many, many of the things that Trump said. And the only reason I think it's so important is that this is a way that newspapers can lose credibility and news organizations can lose credibility. If we assert that things are lies when they could in fact be simple misunderstandings, misstatements, or untruths of another sort, we open ourselves up to criticism from people who say, see, they're biased. See, they assume there's intent there where we don't know if there's intent. And I think that's been a shame.
I think, the way that I would put it is I think there's still a need to call out lies. So I totally understand and respect the idea that, for newspapers to kind of take on that position, it might not be the right job for them or the right role for them. I think this is one of the areas where technology and, kind of instant fact-checking actually has been quite helpful, though. And so Twitter and websites like PolitiFact and even NPR has started to do some of this fact-checking, kind of ongoing live fact-checking of the presidential debates, for example, in 2016. I think that kind of need exists in our democracy. And so if, journalists at the LA Times or the New York Times or even the Washington Post, which was my paper of record as a kid growing up, the idea that that's not appropriate for a newspaper to do or not appropriate for CNN to do kind of in a certain area outside of the opinion, section, I think there is still a need, and I think voters still need that, almost more than ever, I think, given the declines in civic education and the declines in investment in civic education. We really have a critical need for folks to be able to go to some resource and to say, we're actually checking the facts, right? So even if it's like a PolitiFact does, this is 97% true, or this is 42% untrue, they really do try and parse it out. I think those resources do help. So that the burden is not on journalists, who are reporting the news to then do that piece. But I think the piece is still desperately needed in our democracy because folks are not coming with the critical thinking skills or the shared sheet of music that we might assume that they would have been coming with 50 or 60 years ago.
So, go ahead.
Oh, no, and I'm just going to add, I think that oftentimes, especially when you're reading a piece or even seeing a segment on a broadcast or listening to a radio show, that how something is said is oftentimes more important than what is said, because I have an example. When I was at the OC Register and running the opinion page, I had a columnist who will remain nameless who wrote a piece on President Obama at the time and had said President Obama is lying and that makes him a liar. And I changed the piece to say that what President Obama said in this particular instance was untrue and left it at that. That's the only change I made because I thought that that was a better way of communicating this columnist freaked out and went to a blog and took at me like no one's business and said there's a special place in hell for editors, right? And yeah, literally. And
that part's true.
And people gleaned onto this, and it was a thing for a couple weeks, and I got some mail because of it. But I think that when you're trying to share a story in such a politically charged environment with such division, that it's super important to frame things in a way that even when you're coming and calling someone out for saying a lie, that you have to frame it in a way that shows balance and shows language that's not accusatory, but just very unemotional.
Well, this raises something for me I want to ask you all about. So whether you call it a lie, you call it inaccurate, you call it untrue, the resources are there, does it matter? How much does PolitiFact matter? How much does it matter when the Times says this isn't true?
I mean, sometimes it does feel like it doesn't, and that can be the most disheartening thing as a journalist. But I was starting to get there before the 26 campaign. Is this having any impact? And oddly, where the problem has gotten worse, I think it matters more than ever to my initial answer on who's reading the Times these days. I think that if you can reach people and just straighten out what's true and what's false, it's the most always going to be the most worthwhile thing we can do. We can't stop trying to do it, and I think it's having an impact in some major ways this year.
I'll give one example of why it matters, and matters in pretty much the strongest terms I could express. During the 2016 election, a man drove all the way up to Washington, D.C., ready to storm a small storefront because he believed that Hillary Clinton was running a child sex trafficking ring out of that storefront. There could have been mass casualties.
It's a neighborhood pizza
And people
parlor that
dying.
people take their kids to, yeah.
Exactly. There could have been a huge, huge problem. And so I think the more that we can point out, whatever source you use that's actually doing this in a reasonable way, not necessarily making journalists do something they're not comfortable with, you have to do that for our democracy. For those reasons alone. I mean, I know that's just one example, and one example does not equal a trend, but for me, it's the most evocative explanation as to why we need to make sure that fact-checking still remains at the heart of the kinds of things we do in our democracy.
I want to go, if we've exhausted this, I want to go to a couple underlying issues and start with Ange-Marie. So we've been talking about polarization, lack of civility, but there have been profound divisions for decades over issues like reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, questions of race and gender discrimination, and a lot of the debate has been anything but civil and increasingly less civil. Have these cultural wars been intensified by the fragmentation and polarization of the media wars?
Absolutely. And it pains me to say that in the sense that there's been so much progress in terms of integration, right? So today is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. And if we think about that combined with somebody like Maya Angelou, so you were just talking about sometimes the way it's said matters more than what's said, right? She once said, people won't remember what you say, but they will remember the way you made them feel. I think the idea that we still have this fragmentation is not just problematic and sad, of course, but I think something that is exacerbated by the polarization of the media wars. So one of the examples we used in that We the Voters clip, and actually speaks to the Parkland because it was done in Parkland, in the Parkland situation too, was the way in which the media, depending on which side it was on, would actually represent Trayvon Martin, of course, who was a victim of a shooting by George Zimmerman. And so the way in which he was represented physically, I'm talking about the physical image that was used, right, on Fox News looked entirely different, as did the crawl underneath it, than it did on MSNBC, right? And so to the degree that we have these profound schisms in our society that persist, whether they're race-based, whether they're gender-based, or whether they are sexuality-based, I think we really do need to think about how this polarization is just inflaming something that has gone on before. I think the interesting piece about this is whether or not there's been enough of a shift. So I think we were talking about whether or not the Parkland students have really moved the needle on gun safety. And I would agree that they have for the most part for this moment. But I think, what they were able to do in terms of the manipulation of Emma Gonzalez's image. So I don't know if you've been seeing this image that's been going around. So there's one image of what she actually put out, which was of her tearing a shooting target, right, a bullseye shooting target, as her stand against gun violence. And that was manipulated to actually show her tearing up the Constitution, right, for those who were, again, in favor of the Second Amendment, being, a very purist view of the Second Amendment. And so I think those kinds of things are representing not just the issue of gun safety, but also some of the underlying racial and gender, sexual and wars that are continuing to kind of fester, right? So if you look at Emma Gonzalez as a representation of an LGBT woman of color, right, Latina, I think, again, you start to have these things kind of represented even in issues that are not presumed to be primarily racial or primarily gendered or primarily classed.
So the cultural issues interact with the media fragmentation.
Right, and I think, again, what ends up happening is even in an issue that is presumed not to be about race or gender or class, for example, those dynamics end up getting played out through some of these kind of image manipulations.
And I'd also add, so I think that, like, obviously this is a tough topic and there's like a lot of doom and gloom and like I'm going to go home and have to drink a bottle of vodka. But I think that, you know, this is one area where I would say that that I do see some positivity and momentum on the forefront, particularly because I think millennials, and I'm the oldest possible millennial, I'm very proud of this, and Gen Z, which came after millennials, much of the culture wars and much of the media polarization isn't changing their viewpoints or their beliefs and the progress that they're making on really important issues, whether it be LGBTQ issues, which are near and dear to my heart, being a gay man, whether it be reproductive rights, whether it be questions of race and gender. You're seeing progress from this generation, despite the angst, despite the anger, despite the culture wars, despite the political climate, despite the fragmentation of media. So even with all of that happening, we still see progress from this generation. And I think that is one of the pluses. We've talked about some of the minuses of the mob mentality on Twitter and the ability to make fake news or say anything you want and people latch onto it. But one of the positives is you're also connected to anyone and everyone at any time. So someone who was viewed as different from you, or someone who is otherized, or someone whose life experience you might not understand, at any given moment in time, you can connect with them as a human, talk to them, interact with them, tweet at them, snap with them, whatever it is. And I think that human connection, the one-on-one human connection through social media, not the mob mentality of social media, is still making sure that these issues are going in the right direction, and I think they'll continue to do so.
Except that all the studies show that people don't interact with people who are very different from them. They're mostly in communication day in and day out with people who confirm exactly what they already thought.
Is that a generational thing, though? Because I think that confirmation bias is probably at an all-time high for certain generations, but I think for younger generations, particularly Gen Z, but also millennials, that you're seeing some shift in that.
Yeah, and that raises for me what's a very provocative idea, that to some extent the problems we're talking about may be over time self-corrected, and I resemble the remark I'm about to make, as the baby boomers age out and millennials and Generation Z become a huge portion of the population. Maybe some, and they have very decided views on reproductive rights, LGBTQ issues, race and gender discrimination. Maybe you will see not only progress on those issues, but some diminution of the polarization and the sense that we're in a permanent war with each other. Or am I too optimistic?
Just let Generation X take over here and bring some sense to this.
Well, I actually,
I mean,
I'd like to skip to millennials personally.
Yeah.
I'd let the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas kids run the country.
actually, right. Are they Generation Z?
What are
I
they
think
called?
they'd be Gen Z, yeah.
Yeah. So, I do think some things are self-correcting. We're talking about this, right? I mean, and we're working on the problem. And you've seen at times Twitter self-correct, right, where some falsehood really takes hold, and then the Twitter mob actually comes up with something good and corrects the record. So, and then you have the platforms finally realizing they have to be part of the solution. I will remain dubious until they really put up and show something real, but that is at least a shift. So I don't, what we have right now is untenable, and I think a vast majority of Americans realize that.
Since we're taking a moment to talk about positive things before we go back to talking about negative things, I do think that I get up every day and I go onto social media, the same social media that everyone's decrying as so fragmented and terrible, and I get up and I read The Guardian and I read Haaretz and I read the New York Times and I read, other people have distilled for me in their feeds, things from 1,000 other publication. This is in many ways an extraordinary moment for people who are journalists and for people who consume journalism. I mean, we can get more information than we ever could before. We can learn more. We can hear more points of view, and hearing many points of view, in my opinion, is a very good thing, not a bad thing. So theoretically, this could all shake out into a positive scenario if people are open-minded, if people are intellectually honest with themselves, if people are media literate, if people are interested in sophisticated takes on the news. The problem is way too many people don't fit into that category.
And can I add one thing there, is that the reason we are able to call balls and strikes in a way we couldn't for a long time in terms of what's true and what's false, whatever you want to call it, is because of technology. It used to take 15 phone calls to get at whether the first part of it was true. So that's happening faster. So,
Yeah, I mean, you could almost instantly find out that the post office was not losing money because it was delivering Amazon packages. And in the old days, that probably would have been a day or two of reporting and calling, but it's all out there. Now I'm going to go back to being negative for a few minutes again before I get positive.
That was
I'm gonna get
way too
positive
much
again.
positivity.
I promise.
I'm going to try to be positive.
Because I want to go to another phenomenon or story that I think illustrates what may be the fragmentation and the lack of civility and the capacity to believe whatever you want. So I want to talk about the extraordinary stories, and maybe I'll start with Ange Marie. Some of them written by Jim Rutenberg that led to the Me Too movement.
fake news, fake news.
Most of them involved non-political actors, and the media seemed less divided on that on partisan grounds. I mean, Harvey Weinstein, there didn't seem to be a big chorus of people rising up on an ideological basis to defend him. Yet President Trump has survived some tough stories of this kind and has been vigorously defended by some elements of the media. And I don't want to necessarily adjudicate this, but I want to ask the underlying question. Are our political preferences and the way we decide how we're going to weigh information now an all-encompassing lens through which we see and judge everything?
So thank you for asking the question that way, because it gives me an opportunity to be both positive and negative at the same time. I think the Me Too movement and some of the great reporting that Jim and his colleagues have done, as well as the reporting that's just gone on in general, as well as social media. So I think, again, the idea that hashtag Me Too started 10 years ago as a Twitter hashtag, and there's also another site, another handle, Everyday Sexism, which is a more international one. It's located in London, that also has been tracking the ways in which, this has really been a problem long before, kind of what happened just in the past 6 months actually happened. So I say that to be positive about social media and to be positive about reporting. And I also want to say, and this is where I get slightly negative, that I think that is a combination of two things. I think that's not just about reporting or not just about social media. I think that's actually about the organizing infrastructure and the political infrastructure preceding or being in place in order to kind of be a support structure for that. So 7 years ago, I wrote a book. I am one of those rare academics who hates being right, particularly when it concerns this book. So this book was called Solidarity Politics for Millennials, A Guide to Ending the Oppression Olympics. And one of the things I talked about in that book is that millennials, as a generation that does hold, from a public opinion perspective, more quote-unquote progressive views on things like gender equality, on things like LGBT equality, immigrant rights, et cetera, the survey experiment that we ran actually showed that they are just as susceptible to manipulation as Gen X, as baby boomers, and at the time, because it was 7 years ago, we also had many members of the greatest generation still around. And so across those 4 generations, the susceptibility to media manipulation, or manipulation, we were actually doing survey manipulation, so the questions we were asking, right, would kind of swap in and out. Millennials were just as susceptible. So I think one of the things that makes Me Too separate and Me Too different is that people were already worried and mobilized around the Trump presidency, so that there were opportunities for people who were outraged once they found out what was going on Twitter, or found out by reading the New York Times or the LA Times, they actually then had something to do with that anger or something to do with that displeasure. And I think that's why Me Too stands out so differently from maybe other times, specifically about gun violence, if you think about it. Why didn't, why wasn't Sandy Hook the turning point, right? Why wasn't Aurora, Colorado the turning point? All of these questions. And so I think part of that was there was this mobilized moment of anti-Trumpism among women in particular, as well as an infrastructure that had been developing for a year that then meant when these revelations come out in October and in September and everything else, then there's also a place for those folks to kind of channel their anger and their displeasure. So I think all three things really have to fit together for millennials to bring us to where many folks think they will bring us.
Are all these issues, Jim, the kind you've been writing about, Are these all going to be seen through a political lens?
Well, you know, interestingly, on the Harvey story, Fox News was all over it because he was a Democratic donor, right? So that helped. And also two figures from the O'Reilly Ailes era, Gretchen Carlson and Megyn Kelly, were part of that. So I think it still depends a little bit. But, you know, mistreatment of women is a nonpartisan issue, and there are plenty of conservative women who have felt just as indignant as liberal women, and I think that's a major unifying thing. But it's not immune from the ideological sort of war.
But it's nonpartisan up to a point. When, for example, there are allegations about the president, there are people who, in the media, who vigorously defend him and say this is all fake, it's all made up,
Right.
it's all wrong.
He had that, and the difference with Trump and all these other cases is he has a base of voters who either are willing to look the other way or don't, or believe the allegations, but that's not the most important thing in their lives. Whereas for Harvey Weinstein, for corporate America, it was just too much to bear in a lot of these cases. So again, it's like Billy Bush couldn't survive being the wingman in that case. So it was too much for morning TV, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't too much for the Oval Office.
But, I mean, I tend to agree with Bob, or at least to answer yes to Bob's question. I find it hard to hear any issue come up to which I do not get the expected response from people of, you know, viewing it through whatever ideological prism they start out with. And I think the people left of center are just as bad about that as people right of center. I think people lack, you know, a sort of a critical thinking skill these days. They just don't do it. They don't want to do it. It's too easy to simply say, you know, I see this piece of news, you know, I'm looking for a couple of buzzwords to see where it fits in for me on the ideological spectrum, and I'm just gonna take this easy position. And I think that's a real tragedy for the country.
Yeah. I think they may be able to do it, but I think the telling phrase in what you just said was they don't want to do it. And I think there's a lot of that selectivity. I want to get to another of what I think is fundamental issue about how the country functions or doesn't function that's related to this. In 1986, Ronald Reagan passed immigration reform with a path to citizenship, working with Democrats like Ted Kennedy and Republicans like Alan Simpson. Today, he might be called a rhino, Republican in name only. Kennedy got children's health care passed by recruiting Orrin Hatch from Utah. And all Hatch wanted was to make sure the states ran it, because Republicans used to believe that things should all be run by the states. And Kennedy said that was fine with him if there was a national guarantee, and they passed it. And it got signed, and 8 or 9 million kids have health insurance because of it. Now different media beat the drum so hard on different sides of the issues that an Orrin Hatch, if he cooperated in this way, would, and we're running for re-election, which he's not, would face a primary and probably lose it. I don't know, I mean, we'd have a whole different Republican Party if we had Ronald Reagan. But the idea of cooperating across the aisle seems very difficult now, and it seems very hard to deal with a whole range of issues. You have Republicans saying that the Congress isn't going to do anything for the rest of the year except maybe try to pass a rescission of the budget deal they just agreed on. Isn't this kind of media-driven polarization, I think it is driven by the media, a threat not only to governance, but to the survival of democracy itself? I mean, you can't govern.
No, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think that this is one of the scariest phenomenons that we're dealing with, right? Which is that if you are a Republican who crosses the aisle to work with a Democrat, you will be demonized, you will have support groups, you will have millions of dollars spent against you in your primary from someone who's more conservative with you, more conservative than you. Conversely, if you're a Democrat who reaches across the aisle and works with the Republican Party, you're going to have a more progressive Democrat challenger who's well-funded in a primary against you. And, you know, this is a much larger conversation about campaign finance laws and money in politics. politics and all that kind of stuff, but it's most certainly a problem because neither party is incentivized anymore by leadership or by the current structure to work across the aisle. In fact, they're incentivized the other way. They'll get invited to more conferences. They'll be able to speak at more gigs. They'll get more campaign donations. They'll become a cause celeb for their own party if they take a tougher stance against the opposing party, which makes any kind of bipartisan solutions or conversations really, really difficult. I think that we as an industry, media, play a big part of that as well because in many cases we help exacerbate that because on Fox News, if you dare side with particularly a very progressive Democrat on an issue, you're going to be assaulted. And on MSNBC, if you're a progressive Democrat who sides with a conservative Republican on a big issue, God forbid Donald Trump, then you will be assaulted and assailed. And when you have the largest broadcast journalism outfits kind of reinforcing what the pressure groups and the economic backers of each wing, more extreme wing of the parties want, it's cause for alarm and cause for very little getting done, one, and fear that you won't have bipartisan solutions on major issues.
But
sorry.
The one thing I would disagree with, though, is I don't think it's all media originate. It didn't all originate with the media because, and you lived it, right? Newt Gingrich comes along, back when I was still in college. And but,
Now that remark I resent.
Sorry. But so there was a lot going on beneath the surface. The grand bargain that fell apart in the Obama years between Boehner and Obama, it wasn't just Fox News, but it was the gerrymandered districts. There were the changes in campaign finance law that allowed new pressure groups to spring up to pull from the right. So I think it's there's a big complicated puzzle here.
Yeah, but one of the things that struck me in the origin of this question is that Donald Trump at least appeared to be ready to agree to an immigration deal, which the Democrats were ready to enter into and more than happy to enter into, that would have protected the DACA recipients in return for giving him money for his wall. And he got a lot of criticism from the right and from media on the right, and he immediately retreated from the offer. That's what I mean by making it really hard to govern. And I think it's not perfectly symmetrical, Brian, to be honest. I think Democrats are much more ready, Democrats in the leadership, much more ready to make a deal on something like DACA or a deal on infrastructure. And the president, whenever he said, what did he say? He said, I'm going to give you an immigration bill that's full of love. And I mean, when he had the cameras on running in the Oval Office and he had Schumer and Pelosi and the Democrats sitting there and a lot of Republicans looking stunned, and the next day he goes in completely the opposite direction. I'm not saying that all the blame is on one side. I agree with you, it's on both sides. But it does mean that it becomes very difficult to govern the country.
On a side note, one of the things I've always loved about the Kennedy-Hatch relationship and sometime alliance is that it was not an alliance of centrists. It was not about a liberal Republican matching up with a moderate Democrat and finding some narrow area of agreement. It was about a conservative Republican and a liberal Democrat who understood that their job in Congress was to get stuff done and that they were going to be graded or marked on what they accomplished. They were not going to be graded or marked on their rhetoric of outrage that went along with an unwillingness to do anything. And too often I hear people saying, "Oh, what we need more of in Congress is centrists." And I don't really think it's about centrism. I think it's about cooperation and understanding that a functional government is a government that can get things done.
Yeah, well, that's true. Kennedy was the liberal lion of the Senate for a long time, but he also managed to pass more legislation than almost any senator in American history, and maybe any senator in American history. But part of that was because the political differences were never turned into personal differences. And people had and Todd Purdom talked about this morning. People knew each other. They had friendships. That Ronald Reagan was like this. 6 p.m, the battle was over, sit down, talk with people. He actually enjoyed the company of people like Tip O'Neill and Kennedy. That era seems to be gone. And I think that's not media-driven. It's Tea Party-driven, media-driven. It's driven by all sorts of factors. Gerrymandering helps drive it as well.
Yeah, and I think there's one other factor that I think is really important, and I want to go back to the same moment that Jim talked about a few minutes ago, which is 1994. I think one of the things that shifted since 1994, in addition to the Newt Gingrich and the Contract with America kind of era, is also the demographic changes that have happened in our country. And so I think, as you have both gerrymandering, but also a real anxiety among folks, this is folks on the right, about whether or not their message can actually sell to a shifting demographic, to a changing United States in terms of who's casting their votes. Millennials as a generation, and Generation Z is only the more of the same, is the most racially diverse generation in American history. And so to the degree that the Republicans don't have a platform that is actually going to appeal to that more racially diverse generation because of some of these more politically progressive positions that we were just talking about them taking, they have to figure out how to actually continue to remain in power. And by that I mean continue to be the second party in a two-party system. I mean, that's literally the demographic reality they started facing in 1994. And so the question becomes, yes, they had done the Southern strategy prior to that, but the question then becomes, what do you do to make sure you can hold on to whatever power you are able to gain? And I think polarization gets exacerbated by this anxiety about demographic change that then requires appeals to people who normally most Republicans would never associate themselves with, right? They would never associate themselves with a David Duke. They would never associate themselves with, folks who would literally say that Mexicans are rapists, I mean, all kinds of things that, again, most Republicans would never in the 1986, era of Ronald Reagan, ever consider associating themselves with. But that ends up happening because the political necessity is either change your platform to appeal to a broader, more diverse range of voters, or figure out how you're going to be able to keep the kinds of platforms that you really care about and also stay in power at the same time. So for me, the moment where the polarization really just and I really just became frightened about whether or not we would ever be able to govern again was when Democrat Harry Reid exercised, the nuclear option, right? And once that nuclear option dropped, for me as a scholar, I was like, and there it is, and there it goes. Because again, I knew that the Republicans were going to remember that moment.
Oh, you mean abolishing the filibuster?
Yes, exactly.
For the
Sorry.
confirmation of presidential appointees, yeah.
But one thing I'll add on that is, though, that W. Bush and John McCain, certainly in 2000 and the earlier parts, or certain parts of 08, were preaching that gospel. And in fact, for W. Bush, I mean, that was how he won, right? And of course, we don't beat up on Mexico. Right. Wilson in California has it wrong. So when that shifted, I was kind of agape because those are my Republican sources, ones here, preached that to me. And I said, okay, that's modern Republicanism. And then it just shifted so hard.
Yeah.
Okay, we've talked a lot about generations, and I barely missed being a boomer. I'm part of what is called the silent generation. So I think in tribute to that, I'm going to be silent for a while and let you guys ask questions, and then I'll come back at the end. So anybody have a question? Yeah. Leslie, let them bring you a mic.
Hi. I'm just wondering, as you talked about the millennial generation and Gen Z, what your thought is around the notion that in some ways when someone clicks on something or likes something, they feel they've taken action, but the question is, what type of action have they taken? And ultimately, one might argue the best type of action to take is to actually vote, to go to a polling place or to send in an absentee ballot. So I'm just curious about what anybody thinks about the notion that people feel involved simply by clicking or liking.
So I'll speak to that just a little bit. There is a debate among scholars about whether or not that constitutes civic engagement, right? So I think, again, among younger folks who are more involved with social media, the idea that a like or a click constitutes some action that would be comparable with voting or comparable with writing your senator or doing something, that we would, in previous generations, have considered civic engagement. I think public opinion-wise, they believe that they are doing something. I think the challenge has been, and I have a colleague in Annenberg, Henry Jenkins, who does a lot of work around this, is whether or not that's going to lead to meaningful change, right? So the classic example is from a few years ago, the Coney 2012 campaign, which was a campaign organized by millennials to actually get out Joseph Kony, who was a supposed war criminal, an accused war criminal. I'm trying to be journalistically appropriate here. He'd not been convicted or held according to trial. And so the idea was he was a war criminal, and there was a Facebook and social media campaign that went viral. It went completely viral with people clicking like and sharing it and posting it and cross-posting it. And of course, Joseph Kony to this day remains at large, has never once been captured, right? So I think there's two questions at stake. One is, what do people think they're doing? And I think the other piece is whether or not actual change happens. And so I think with the Coney 2012 example, you see people thinking they're really contributing to something, but then, of course, given the cycle and the fact that people probably forgot about it right after they clicked like, whether or not that leads to tangible change.
Another question? Just bring a mic over. We'll get both of you.
I was wondering, there's a bunch of studies that the more the media cover who's up, who's down, and success in terms of politics, in terms of, who's doing better at the ballot box, polling, the more it eats away at institutional trust, including the media itself. So the media is actually cannibalizing itself when it says all of those politicians are doing self-interest. We imply also media may be as well. But I think things like Twitter and social media, it's easier to tweet who's up, who's down, rather than even a sentence or two about policy. So how do we get the conversation more focused on the policy, which is considered more trustworthy, more legitimate, more civil, and off the sports comments and off the who's up and who's down every minute?
Well, as long as I've been a journalist, I've heard people complain, and goes back 30 years now. I've heard people complain, you guys don't cover the issues. It's always the horse race. It's always the sensation, this and that. And it's not really true. I mean, maybe it's true on TV, maybe it's true on the internet. I don't know. In the world of relatively serious journalism that I come from, we cover a lot of horse race, and we cover a lot of issues too, and people don't really read the issues. People don't want to read 10,000, words on a candidate's transportation plan, but we offer it, and they skip it. So I'm not exactly sure what the solution is, but I think that the charge, not from you, but from the one I've heard a zillion times, is I think it's a little bit unfair. A newspaper like the LA Times or the New York Times or the newspaper Newsday that I started out at, I mean, we did endless eat your vegetables sort of coverage that people could find out every possible piece of information they wanted about what would happen if they voted for this candidate for supervisor or judge or any of, I'm not just talking about presidential races, but at every level along the way. So the information is there for people who want it. The question is, again, going back to what I said earlier, how do we educate people and make them the kind of news consumers who want that information? What have we done wrong that they're only interested in the horse race?
Well, that sort of blames the readers, and I think there's some element.
I take it back.
Some element.
I thought you were being quiet too. What happened to the silent generation?
No, because this demands a follow-up. If you lived through 2016, the press reported much more on Trump's peccadillos and on Hillary's email than on the issue differences between them, and I suspect a lot of those folks in Wisconsin and Michigan who voted for Donald Trump had no idea what was really in his tax plan. All they heard, if they cared about it at all, was, I'm going to cut your taxes. Is that an unfair characterization of what happened?
No, I think that's fair. That's fair. It's probably, there are more policy pieces than we all get credit for. Trump overwhelmed everything. And don't forget that there was a whole period in the beginning of the campaign where he was not taken. He was almost like the comic relief, right? And the Rubio campaign, after they dropped out, told me that they were told by CNN producers when they started, well, okay, you're going to get a soft bio piece when you announce. We'll give your announcement a big splash, and then we're going to do some hard reporting on your policy proposals, which we know CNN, like, no matter what, they're only going to do so much. But Trump didn't get that same scrubbing in the beginning, so that gave him an enormous head start. So it did, Trump overwhelmed all of that, and I think that was a deficiency in everybody's coverage to some degree. To answer the question, though, about what happens with the horse race versus substance, the one thing we have now is that I hate having is analytics. I can press a button and I know how many clicks my piece has got. It's very depressing to see how the policy piece is doing that.
Yeah,
it's like
100%.
and a credit to our organizations that they keep putting the resources there. But what we can do and what could fix this is see what changes we can make to the meat and potato stories or the eat your vegetable stories that could make them more engaging. And that's the idea for the numbers. But add a Donald Trump into that as a novelty candidate who becomes a front runner, and
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is, I think, thinking about novel ways to actually transmit the information as well, right? So there's a number of brain studies that have shown that literally our brains are changing as we are exposed to just 280 characters now, or just to what's posted on social media, where we will read just the headlines. We even do this with our own emails now, right? Not just things that actually matter for us, as opposed to something we're just kind of randomly reading. And so one of the things is to, again, think about format and the way in which, policy issues maybe do need to be communicated in not long form journalism, and not even maybe a 750-word op-ed, if it's an opinion piece, but instead need to be transmitted in other ways.
graphic.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think that's actually something that newspapers have gotten a lot better at. So, I don't necessarily teach the kinds of classes anymore that require those kinds of analytics, but I do rely on them when I do, in terms of the different graphics. And I think those are things that students can kind of grapple with a little bit more than, expecting them or assuming, that they will read closely even 750 words.
Question back here, and then we'll come here.
So I want to express this frustration. Earlier I mentioned that I was running, earlier panel, some of you guys weren't here, that I'm running for Secretary of State, and the main thing I'm running on is to promote proportional representation elections in California. And with all due respect, we don't have a two-party system. We have a single-seat, winner-take-all district system that produces a binary dynamic, and yet almost all of our political analysis is entirely devoid of understanding how that forces everybody into two camps. And if we had a multi-seat democracy with proportional representation, people like you talked about who don't have a place today in politics would have a place in one of several parties. And it just makes my head want to explode that we take this as a gospel that we have to have these kind of dynamics, and yet it isn't necessary that we have to have these. And we internalize racism, we internalize sexism, and we undo that, but we don't talk about internalizing winner-take-allism. And that's a real problem that we have. And I wish that political punditry and the talking heads in the state would start talking about the issues and say the electoral system is a large part of the problem.
Well, maybe somebody up here can fix that.
Me? I have
Yeah.
to fix it?
Yeah.
I don't want to speak to the issue of proportional representation, but I will certainly say it is absolutely true that, like everyone else in our society, we at newspapers take certain things for granted. We start from certain assumptions, and too often we don't see that there are other ways of looking at things, other points of views that will allow us to question, even the most fundamental underpinnings of the way our system works, and we ought to do more of that. We try to do it on the op-ed page, for instance. That's a place where people can come from outside the paper and say, hey, you idiots, you proceed from the assumption that the two-party system is the only way to go. Well, here's another way of thinking about it. And I think whenever we do that stuff, it's often mind-expanding and interesting, and we should do more of it.
I think one of the interesting things that's happened in California is this kind of top two primary system, and the way in which that does create an opportunity for multiple parties in an ideal kind of sense, right? I mean, the challenge, of course, is that the two parties that we have right now are much better funded, are much better institutionalized, and have the infrastructure that allow them to continue to dominate. And really one party, you're right, the Democratic Party, in California right now with regard to this primary change. And so I think, there are opportunities for structural change. I think any place, if there's any place in the union where this could actually happen right now, I think it is California, given the fact that we have, relative to the other 49 states, a comparatively easier way to change our constitution, right? We have this ballot and initiative system, right, that doesn't require us to go to the powers that be to change the actual constitution, right? We can get something on the ballot. Now, again, this is a huge state. That's a hugely expensive, phenomenon. And so I think, if any place for you to run for Secretary of State to actually try and get this into place, I think you can actually do it in California relative to the other places.
Okay, I think we can do one more question. Yeah. Oh, and then we got to, Murphy came all the way. We got to get Murphy. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Is this on? Yeah. There's been a lot of discussion about the polarization all day that's inflicting the country, but there have been few suggestions offered on how to build national relatedness on a big scale so that we as a country can start moving forward in a much more purposeful and successful fashion. I'm curious what, if any, suggestions any of you have to address that.
Can we put that off until after we're done with the Q&A? Because that's basically my last question. Murphy. Oh, you need a mic, Mike. Even you.
No, thank you, Bob. No, just listening to this, and I'm just wondering aloud to provoke answers here. But we're very focused on the saddle, but we're kind of ignoring the horse. In other words, the voters may choose a lot of this. There's a reason they choose watching Stormy Daniel over the 40-point piece on asparagus or whatever. There is a reason social media is coarse because it has no filter, because the country is coarse and it's vernacular. So I'm always struck that we seem to be in a dichotomy where the right would say, let it all be open, and who knows, maybe a pre-aware title from reality television will get elected president. And the left wants to fix people. We're going to fix the system. We're going to fix the news. We're going to put training wheels on this. But if the problem is people and cultural, then is democracy the model that works?
Anybody want to take that up?
On television.
I mean, I think it's... go ahead.
I think some of this, and this gets to broader policy issues that a hack like yours truly, it's beyond my realm of expertise, but it does seem that the educational system's broken down, that, was a generation raised on books, better at critically thinking than a generation weaned on reality TV. Social media brings the attention span down even more. So it does seem to be, when it's always the thing that makes people's eyes glaze over, but it's probably the most important thing, is teaching critical thinking, raising the educational standards, and we know how frustrating that has been in this country, and it's one of those debates that runs aground in a frustrating way. So it's way bigger than anything we can do at the newspaper, though our editorial board can advocate for things, right?
I suspect it is what the voters want, but I suspect that the media have reinforced that, and there aren't that many alternatives out there, although I think that the alternatives have to be more accessible to people.
I am the lead Stormy reporter, by the way.
I know.
So,
don't you? I said.
but it's a campaign finance story, and no one wants that part of the story. But
I was going to
I've
say,
been
to be
doing
clear, I'm
that,
not saying
yeah.
don't read Jim's
Yeah.
work. Okay.
No, and I think that your question ties into the question that you asked earlier, which is that people like the personality stories. People like the celebrity stories. I mean, there's a reason that Donald Trump got so much attention, and there's a reason I think that the Washington Post and the New York Times and some of the national publications are actually doing well in terms of digital subscribers, because people are either petrified of what this man will do next, or they want to tune in for the latest season of The Apprentice, which is happening live from the Oval Office. So, I think that people want the personalities, and they're attracted to that. That's why more people vote on American Idol than they do in presidential elections. And so, trying to answer your question whether or not democracy is the right model for people is, I think, a really tough one to answer. I don't know that there's a better system in the world that is able to bring people together and help a society govern. But in its current operation in the United States of America, with our current political climate, with our current media, it sure makes things very difficult to accomplish.
Okay, I'm going to break my rule. One quick question and a quick answer, and then I'm going to ask a closing question. Wait for a mic.
You used a very political, kind term in political lens. And what you really have, what you're really talking about is slanting the news. And the three newspapers that we talk of there seem to me to slant the news constantly. The front page now looks like the editorial page. And I think the credibility of the newspapers has slipped dramatically because you are taking, if you're talking about Trump, every story starts out negative. Every single story. I don't see anything positive about anything that he's done, period. And I think you've lost credibility, period.
Jim?
Well, first of all, I would say if I could sit here and show you plenty of stories that would that would argue at that point. But you know what? There's a Russia investigation going on right now. There's a trade war with China going on, or almost trade war with China going on. He generates a lot of controversial news, so sometimes the news coverage reflects what's going on in Washington. So there's that. I mean, well, no, it's not all negative as far as I'm concerned. You could see that we did a front page story recently about how his removal of regulations is helping the economy. But please talk specifics, and we could go through it story by story.
I think one area where I've seen.
Well, let's.
We have.
Look,
I've got all night.
Yeah, look. If you look at my Twitter feed or your Twitter feed, there are tons of attacks on the New York Times and on specific reporters, Jim, Maggie Haberman, because they're too kind to Trump. So there's a criticism that comes from the other side as well. I don't know at this point how you cover the Russia investigation without, at some level, sounding critical. When you report that that the special counsel has indicted a whole group of people on a whole set of charges, I guess that's going to come across as critical. But
can I take the other side for 1 sec? I mean, I'm a liberal Democrat. I don't like President Trump. We wrote on our editorial page, a really scathing series about Trump that, it doesn't get much more negative than that. But I, too, I share some of your concerns, probably not all of your concerns, and I do worry that on the news pages of the paper, I do believe there are a lot of people in newsrooms all across the country, including at the New York Times and the LA Times, who are very dismayed by the election of President Trump, who do believe that newspapers and journalism is one of the ways we're going to fight against this guy. And I do believe they have allowed things to slip into the paper that run up against our years-long rules on ourselves about keeping our biases out of the paper. I think that the discussion we had earlier about whether we said that the president lies is an example of that. I don't think we should have said that, and I think it happened because I do believe there are a lot of people in newsrooms, people who are making decisions about what the headlines say, and people who are making decisions about which stories to run on page one and where they should be played. I think we really have to fight at a time like this, when the nation is so polarized. We really have to fight not to be dragged down into the tit-for-tat, see everything with an ideological lens, and we have to fight to maintain our standards and to treat Donald Trump fairly and honestly, even as we challenge him when he tells untruths, even as we cover this investigation against him. We have to cover the hell out of him, and a lot of that is going to be negative because there's a lot of negative stuff out there, but we have to pull back from allowing our biases to overtake us.
Oh, go on, yes.
Oh, no, and I was going to say, and I think a lot of people in the country feel your frustration, and that's where you see the polls from Pew and others come in, where people, and I think people on the right and Republicans for a very long time have said that most media outlets in this country, mainstream media outlets, have a particular perspective. And there's some data to back that up. I mean, when you do polls of the political leanings of newsroom reporters, it's almost universally left-leaning, and that's fine. I think a lot of journalists do an amazing job of concealing those biases. I think in the era of the aftermath of the 2016 election, and even during it, we've seen that, to Nick's point, change a little bit and continue to change. I think that the way that you solve for that, or at least one of the ways you solve for that, is you go above and beyond in trying to achieve balance. I cut my teeth at the Orange County Register, which is a right-leaning libertarian editorial page and has been for a very long time. But I've realized that if you're going to persuade people, if you're going to have a real dialogue, if you're going to have real discourse, you have to bring in people with differing opinions. So I brought in a weekly columnist who was a representative for the labor union. I brought in Erwin Chemerinsky, a liberal professor, to do a weekly, or law dean actually, to do a weekly column for us, because I wanted to show that there was balance. And I think in this era where so many people don't trust mainstream media and are really concerned, particularly as it comes to news reporting on the president, that you have to go above and beyond in showing that balance, and it has to be very explicit. Otherwise, I think the credibility will diminish further.
I'll give Jim a final word on this question, then I'm going to ask the final question of the day and let each of them give a response.
All right, I was going to start going through some no, I'm just kidding. I agree with plenty of that. But I do think that the line is, do you start not correcting something that's false, lest Trump supporters get offended? That
Certainly not.
You know what, right, of course, I don't think anyone at this table would say you would, but that's a sort of trap. And another issue that's happening, a change in the industry, which I think is bad, but I don't think this is going to change, is it is a belief in newsrooms that the younger readers want to see a little attitude or personality in the writing. I wasn't raised that way, and I don't really like the trend, but it's where it's going, and that's why where we did have a problem, and I've been outspoken about this, is some younger reporters, most of whom coincidentally were not covering Trump or politics, would spout off on Twitter against Trump, and our editor said, you are not, if you work for this newspaper and you're in the newsroom, you're not on the editorial side, cut it out. And that ended up being controversial from the other side, well, from both sides, because one side said, well, you're stanching free speech. And from the right, it was, well, let us see your true opinions. And the truth is, as we all know, it's about your opinion doesn't matter when you're covering the news. That's the discipline.
So we have only a few minutes, and I haven't saved 15 because the audience questions were so interesting. But starting down with Brian and coming this way, and maybe the most important question of the day, and this has been asked in various forms, is there much hope for a restoration of stability, of civility, that we're going to see a de-escalation of the media and culture wars, that we'll once again live in a society where facts are not dismissed as fake news and people don't decide what's true based on their embedded preconceptions?
I think so. I mean, I hope so. I think we have to survive as both a democracy and a country. I think that it's too important, and I think that just by having conversations like these, we're on the right track. I think that you're seeing Generation Z in particular, and some millennials as well, very frustrated with the current state of both politics and media in this country, and they're taking stands. They're most certainly, I hope, becoming more critical. But I think it's, if we aren't able to overcome this hurdle, then I'd be afraid to see what this country looked like long after I'm gone or anyone up here are gone. And so for me, I firmly believe that just like with any moment in history, there are ebbs and flows and changes. And we're at a point in history where we are a nation divided. We are at, maybe as divided as ever before. But I think that in the times of the deepest division is when you have a chance for the deepest reconciliation. And I think there is a point at which we will have an opportunity for reconciliation. I think it's going to take, frankly, a transformational figure that not only, I don't think it's a media person, I frankly think it's a political figure who comes and says we need to bring this together somehow and is able to work within the political dynamics of both sides, and I think that will help bring media to the table. I think that will help bring policymakers to the table, and I hope in turn that helps bring the country together.
Nick?
Well, it's all very demoralizing. I mean, to go back to Mike's question, I mean, you have to question whether democracy is even working. Certainly the events of the last, I think this has been coming for 20, 30 years. I don't know what started it. Is it the end of the fairness doctrine, or the death of Walter Cronkite, or Jacob Javits, or the Bork nomination? Who knows what it was that set us on this spiral of incivility, polarization, dysfunction? It's very, very worrisome, and we'd be crazy not to be asking ourselves, whether it's going to be fixed, in our generation or at all. That said, I'm a fundamentally optimistic person. I believe that, I believe there'll be a backlash. I mean, I can really mostly only speak to the journalistic side of this thing. I mean, there was a period where people were, outraged at the mainstream media because we hid our biases, and I don't know. I think that, and they said, there shouldn't be any gatekeepers. It's such a great thing. The internet has gotten rid of gatekeepers. Well, I think there's going to be a backlash against all that. I think people are going to wake up and they're going to say, no. There is such a thing as truth. We want to know what truth is. We want to go to places that we can trust. We don't want to continue to distrust everything. And some people are going to slowly but surely start to come back and say, where can we go to really understand what's happening in the world, and so that we can make intelligent judgments about them. And then I think it gets back to what I was saying before. I think you have to have education on media literacy. Maybe you got to have civics classes again. Maybe you got to find ways to bring people together to talk about civility and about free speech and about the importance of hearing other people's ideas and alternative viewpoints to your own. Maybe people have to be retaught these things, but I believe it can be done. I hope so.
Ashmarie?
So a couple things. One of the things, just to Nick's point just now, both the American Enterprise Institute and Everyday Democracy, so two on the right and the left civic engagement organizations, agree that an investment in civic education is required. And I think this is a larger education policy kind of question because, again, we have poured many, 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 many resources into things that do matter, like STEM education, for example. But what that has meant is that it has come at the cost of civic education. And now we are reaping the outcomes and the consequences of that disinvestment in civic education over 2 or 3 generations now. So I think that that's particularly problematic. Whether or not these things will change, I think, is contingent upon something that we've talked a lot about today and then something we haven't necessarily talked as much about today. I think it is contingent on some of the journalistic norms and how people are going to kind of come back and whether or not they will come back and want truth and want, balance. And I think people will. But I think those things are going to be much harder to achieve as long as there are persistent and highly stratified forms of inequality in this country. And so I think to the degree you continue to have, this is equal pay day for gender, for example, right? So this is the day to which women have to work in order to actually make as much as a male made in 2017. Right, so we were at April 4th, so women had to work 4 months longer. And once you start parsing that out by race and gender, it gets to literally the last day, and I believe this is for Native American women, is somewhere in November of this year. So we're talking about these persistent inequalities that really do kind of create this kind of double-edged sword. I think they want more truth. I think they want to be, able to trust media sources, but when they see newsrooms that don't look like them, when they see reporting that doesn't necessarily reflect the realities on the ground, like, so why are we surprised by what's going on in Sacramento when we saw what happened in Ferguson, 3 years ago? So those kinds of things, I think, then brook that distrust and make people want to turn just to the opinion folks, right? So how do we think about that in a newsroom context versus just relying on Charles Blow, who I read all the time, or even David Brooks, who I also read all the time, The other thing I want to say just to conclude is that I think this is a larger phenomenon that has been going on for far longer than maybe we've been wringing our hands over. So, we went back to 1994, but I was reminded in the question that Mike asked a few minutes ago that John Dewey wrote about this in The Public and Its Problems in the first part of the 20th century, right? If you go back, I teach that in my political theory class. My grad students come back and they're like, oh my God, I feel like I'm reading about right now, where people are very, very concerned with the lack of literacy and civics and other ways of thinking that really then make it hard for our democracy to function. And so I think the historical view helps us understand that perhaps we can have a sunnier view, meaning that our democracy can actually survive.
Jim?
I think that the fact-based debate, that we're sort of pulling back from the abyss, again, discussions like this, the Facebook and Twitter getting in the game. But I think when it comes to civility, as long as people on the platforms reward the coarsest voices and cable news rewards the coarsest voices, and I don't see that changing, I don't see a break in sort of the quality of civil discourse.
Well, I was hoping to end on a hopeful note.
I'll flip them around.
Broadcast news is going away soon, so we'll be okay. Don't worry. There you go.
Look, I want to thank Jim, Nick, Brian, Ange-Marie, all the participants on our panels today, all of you in the audience. Once again, our very deep gratitude to Leslie Berger, Paul Williams, and Erica Berger for making this extraordinary set of conversations happen. They're great public citizens and a great and generous presence on the USC campus. Perhaps the message or the hope today is fight on with a commitment to mutual respect and to telling the truth. Thanks, everybody.